All right. Bismillah wa salatu wa salam ala rasulillah wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa man wala. Amma ba'd. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, everyone. So you're getting sleepy, sounds like. Well, when Sheikh Ammar was talking about my kids, that's how he got me to come. Is because he said, Safiya told me that the Prophet Yusuf alayhi salam is her favorite prophet, so don't break her heart. You have to come to this event so she can learn about the Prophet Yusuf alayhi salam. So if you're sleepy, I feel you. Let's see how well my brain works at 11 o'clock at night. So inshallah. All right. So, when I was praying Taraweeh and I was listening to Surah Yusuf, subhanAllah, one of the things that I always find amazing about the Quran is that you can hear the same verses so many times, and suddenly something like a light bulb moment will happen and it hits you differently than it did all the times before. And so as I'm standing there, all the notes that I had for talking to you today, which we will go into, inshallah, none of those were coming to my mind as I was listening to the story of the Prophet Yusuf alayhi salam. There were all these different things that were coming to mind. And actually, a lot of the things that were standing out were about the Prophet Yaqub, alayhi salam, his father, and his parenting as a parent. So it was just amazing. So I'm sure a lot of you have that experience as well in hearing the story. And I hope, inshallah, as we go through this theme that I'm going to talk about that shows up in the story of the Prophet Yusuf alayhi salam, inshallah, it's going to help you to see his story in a different light, and inshallah in a way that can resonate in your own lives. So the way that I want to start this is to acknowledge that the story of the Prophet Yusuf alayhi salam is filled with a lot of trial, tribulation, trauma, pain, betrayal, all of these hardships that we see in his life. And a lot of different themes start to shine through as you see the danger that he goes through. But the theme that I want to touch on, as Sheikh Ammar mentioned, is how to reflect on the difficult circumstances that we go through in our own lives through a lens of goodness and resilience in the way that the Prophet Yusuf alayhi salam was able to do. And the growth that we see in his story and how we can translate that into growth in our own lives. So what the Prophet Yusuf alayhi salam exhibited throughout his story, as we see, there's a concept in psychology called post-traumatic growth. In order to achieve this particular type of growth, you have to go through something hard. You have to go through something that would be considered traumatic. And what we see in this story is how much trauma he goes through, yes, but how much growth he achieves through that trauma. And this concept, like you might think of the story of the Prophet Yusuf alayhi salam, and you might think, okay, well, he grew through his trials because he's a prophet. He grew through this because he is somebody who is sent by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, who received inspiration by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But the research actually shows that over 50% of people who go through a traumatic experience post-traumatic growth. So it's something that we can all hope to achieve. We all go through difficulties. And so we all have the choice of whether we want to try and grow through those difficulties or allow our lives to just pass us by and take us as a storm would. And so here's what post-traumatic growth is. It is defined in 5 ways through 5 characteristics. And as I mention these 5 characteristics, I want you each to think about a struggle that you are going through now, or a struggle that you have gone through, and consider which of these characteristics have I been able to display and how I cope with it? Have I been able to gain through that experience? Or even ways that I can try to gain those things through my difficult experiences, right? So see what can resonate with you. So the first, when you're talking about post-traumatic growth, and as you listen to this, also see if you can identify them in the story of the Prophet Yusuf alayhi salam. The first is, after a difficult experience, people can gain a greater appreciation of life. Think about that. When somebody is at like a point of darkness, when somebody feels like they're going through such a difficult circumstance, it changes their perspective, and they can come away with a sense of gratitude where even the mundane details of life can feel suddenly so wonderful. Even just think about a small example. When here in Houston, what happens all the time whenever there's a storm? Power goes out, water goes out, right? The little things that we could do with that power, with that water, suddenly we can't do anymore. When that power comes back, when that water comes back, suddenly you have an appreciation. It's a mundane detail in our very privileged lives, but suddenly we feel it, we see it, right? So going through hardship can help to increase our appreciation of life. The second is an increased closeness in relationships. A lot of times when you go through something difficult, it makes you appreciate the things that really matter. And a lot of times the things that really matter are the people who are closest to us, the people who mean the most to us. And so we can then invest in relationships in a different way. We see that very clearly in the story of the Prophet Yusuf alayhi salam. The third is the identification of new possibilities. So the idea that, like, a lot of times when we have a life-changing experience, it shifts our priorities. Think about it in your own life, in anybody's life who you know has gone through something really intensely difficult. Suddenly things seem clearer. Opportunities show up, especially like in the worship of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, in a very different way. Especially sometimes we don't notice opportunities until those opportunities are at a risk of being lost. And then suddenly we realize, man, if I had only had more time, if I had only taken that opportunity, if I had only taken that chance. The fourth is increased personal strength. A lot of times we don't know how strong we are until we need that strength, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sends us the strength that we need in those moments. A lot of times we have qualities that we would not otherwise have had if we did not go through that difficult experience. And so our personal strength, suddenly, after going through something so terrifying, the other things that we might have thought to be difficult suddenly seem like nothing. The challenges don't seem so challenging anymore. And then the fifth and final one is a greater sense of spiritual development. Going through suffering a lot of times turns us toward Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It can result in spiritual and religious growth and increased closeness to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because when our priorities change, Allah can become recentered in our lives. And that's a beautiful indication of passing that test that's being sent to us. So post-traumatic growth can be a way of passing the tests that are sent our way. So those are the 5 categories. Now let's delve into the story of the Prophet Yusuf alayhi salam and see how these show up in his story. So I want to start from the point after he has experienced the betrayal of his brothers who had put him in a well. He was sold as a slave, and then he faces a new struggle where he's in the employment of someone and the wife of the Aziz tries to seduce him. And when she tries to seduce him, he becomes wrongfully accused of trying to seduce her. And so when he refuses, in the Quran, they're racing toward the door. She tears his shirt, right? And he defends himself when she tells her husband, what will you do to somebody who tries to seduce your wife? And he says, it's her. She's the one who tried to seduce me. And so what lesson just from this one part do we gain? Is to advocate for yourself. If there is something wrong, if somebody is saying something that is untrue, inaccurate, don't be shy. Don't hold back from advocating for yourself in that circumstance, even in a circumstance as terrifying as this one, where he knows it's his word against somebody with significantly more power and resources. He still advocated for himself. And speaking up during moments of anxiety can be so empowering. Like, I remember, most of you are significantly younger, but I remember being in high school during 9/11 when all of that had happened. And it was a very difficult, tumultuous time living in New York, experiencing that firsthand, the tragedy of it, but also the repercussions for somebody who was visibly Muslim, because I was wearing hijab at the time. And I remember there was an assignment that my ELA teacher had given us where you could do a presentation about anything you wanted. And I chose to do a presentation about the rights of women in Islam. And the reason I chose that is because before 9/11, Muslims were really very much under the radar. Like nobody really knew about us. They just thought we were a little weird, but nobody really cared. But then after 9/11, there was, a lot more opinions. And so I did that. And I remember like my ELA professor, teacher, he let me speak for the entire ELA period about this and answer questions and things like that. And I remember feeling so empowered after that. I felt so uplifted and I felt so much lighter because I felt like I could advocate for myself in that moment in a way that I couldn't have otherwise done. And so it's this idea of being able to, my son is waving in, being able to speak up on your own behalf and on the behalf of other people as well. So I think that that's a really powerful lesson that he shows us. Then in this moment, the Prophet Yusuf says something incredible. He prays to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and he says, I would rather be in jail than do what you invite me to. And if you don't turn their cunning away from me, I might yield to them and fall into ignorance. So this is when he's being, tempted, being seduced. He's asking Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to protect him from this. And how does a young man in a situation like this not only resist the temptation, but resist it more than once and choose imprisonment over falling into this trap? How does he do this? Like, that's a very difficult situation to find yourself in, and scary as well for him to choose between his identity as a worshiper of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala or being unjustly imprisoned. And this concept of trying to choose between your values and the easy path is something that we struggle with every single day. Every single one of you who gets up and puts on her hijab is choosing a path, is not choosing the path of least resistance, but choosing a harder path. Every one of you who between classes or at work chooses to prioritize your salah and, risk seeming strange to your coworkers or whatever it is, you choose a path that's more difficult. And that's what the Prophet Yusuf is teaching us here, is that a lot of times the path of least resistance is not the path that's beloved to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And so when we feel a sense of anxiety, sometimes that anxiety is because we're not living in a way that is aligned with our values. And the Prophet Yusuf here is telling us that if I choose this path of giving into this temptation of not being imprisoned, how can I live with that? How can I live with not living my values? And that is very powerful for us to realize we're in a time when we are strangers, that it's okay to be a stranger, that we have models of people who were strangers, and those are the models that we aspire to. And so this is how the Prophet Yusuf could embrace such a difficult decision, because he's choosing to align his actions with his values. So asking ourselves, is that the Rasul tells us that if something wavers in your soul, you should abandon it. So what's wavering in your soul today? What's the decision that you're trying to make that you're feeling uncomfortable? You're feeling uncomfortable about the choice that you're making, and you know that there's another choice. It's harder, but you also know it's better. And can you pick that path? Can you take a small step toward that path? And then we see that the Prophet Yusuf he asks Allah to protect him. He says, I would rather be imprisoned. And so Allah answers his dua and he puts him in prison, right? And so sometimes our dua is answered in unexpected ways. Without a doubt, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala could have protected him from this woman, from this situation without imprisoning him. But his dua was responded to in this way. And so this is something for us to remember too, is that sometimes we make dua, we want something, we ask for something so deeply, so much, and it doesn't come to fruition in exactly the way that we wanted it to. And sometimes that can make us lose hope. But we see in the story of the Prophet Yusuf that every step is needed to reach the culmination that we see at the end of his story, including this imprisonment. So sometimes our dua is not, we don't see the fruition of it in the way that we exactly expect, or in a way even that's painful, but every step is part of a greater plan of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for us. And so the Prophet Yusuf ﷺ is in prison alongside two prisoners, and he shares with them the unique skill he has, the unique skill of dream interpretation. And in the process of doing this, he is calling them to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He tells them, this is part of Allah's grace upon us and humanity, but most people are not grateful. As he's talking about the oneness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that this is a part of Allah's grace upon us and humanity. It's a reminder that in the end, this guidance, this faith is a gift. This is not a favor to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that we are worshiping him. He doesn't need that from us. It's a gift. And even sitting in prison, the Prophet Yusuf alayhi salam is talking about the favors of Allah, the grace of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And in having that sense of gratitude in moments of difficulty is extremely transformative. Whatever struggle you are going through, if you can find something in that moment to be grateful for, it makes it so much easier to navigate that struggle. And so we learn that from the example of the Prophet Yusuf alayhi salam, and that he never attributes to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala anything except for goodness. He never asks Allah, why did you put me in prison? Why am I going through these hardships? You did this to me. Nothing, astaghfirullah, in terms of that dynamic. It's all about attributing goodness to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And so the Prophet Yusuf alayhi salam is showing us that he is proud, as he's giving da'wah to these prisoners, he's showing us that he's proud of his identity as a believer, that this is something that he holds on to, right? So not to belittle this example, but the example that just came into my head, how many of you have ever watched or read the Harry Potter series? Some hands. All right, there's a lot of you that have not, so this is not going to hit well for those of you who have not, but for those of you who are fans and who have, there's this scene where the godfather of Harry Potter, Sirius Black, talks about how he was in prison with these weird creatures called, this is going to sound really weird for people who don't know about Harry Potter, but anyway, he was in this prison with these weird creatures called Dementors who steal bits of your soul as part of the punishment, and most people go insane. And the reason that he didn't go insane is because he held on to his identity as an innocent man who had not committed the crime that he was imprisoned for. This was not in my notes, so tell me this is what you get for bringing me in the middle of the night to give a talk. You get Harry Potter examples, but okay, so in this scene of the story of the Prophet Yusuf alayhi salam, I just want you to think about it for a moment and realize how much resilience it takes for somebody to be unjustly imprisoned and have the energy to call to the message of Islam and to stick with his identity as a believer, and that's what maintains his resilience. It's not that he is just resilient. It's that he is resilient because he maintains his identity at the core of himself, that he is a worshiper of Allah. That is what gives him the resilience that he needs in order to overcome all of the obstacles that he's going through. And so when you are feeling anxious about a decision, when you are trying to decide a path, asking yourself, which path is going to be something that brings me closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? Which path, which choice am I going to be happy to see in my book of good deeds on the day of judgment? Because whatever choice I make now, the good of it in this life, the temporary gratification in this life, it's going to end at some point. But when you make a choice that aligns with who you are at the core as a worshiper of Allah, that choice never goes away. That choice will last all the way until the day of judgment and inshallah into the akhirah as a reward for you in Jannah. And this is what the Prophet Yusuf alayhi salam knew. And he was also proactive. He didn't wait for them to ask. He didn't wait. He's sharing his gift of dream interpretation. He's sharing the gift of the message of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And so we learn from that, do not wait for the right circumstances to come your way. Create those circumstances for yourselves. If you view yourself as somebody who wants to be more helpful, I'm a helpful person. I want to be a helpful person. If you view yourself as a helpful person, don't wait for an opportunity to help to come and fall into your lap. search for it. However you view yourself, search for an opportunity to be proactive instead of waiting for it to come and being reactive. And this is what the Prophet Yusuf ﷺ does. So now, in the story of the Prophet Yusuf ﷺ, there's one of the prisoners is executed, another prisoner is released from prison. And the Prophet Yusuf ﷺ had asked this prisoner, when you're released, put in a good word for me. And he had forgotten, and then Quran says the shaitan had caused him to forget. But then at one point, the king comes and asks for an interpretation of a dream. And suddenly he remembers Yusuf ﷺ, because Yusuf ﷺ had shared this gift proactively, right? And so when this happens, Yusuf ﷺ provides the interpretation. And when I was listening in Tarawih, I realized, which I didn't realize before, is Yusuf ﷺ provides the interpretation without expecting anything in return. He could have used that as leverage, right? Like he could have said, okay, I'll give you this interpretation if, your boss will come and, release me. But first I need to be released. He could have used it as leverage, but he didn't. He realized he had a gift and he wanted to use that gift, and he didn't make it conditional. And I thought that was a really beautiful reminder. So after he gives this interpretation, the king says, the man returns to the king, and the king says, okay, bring this man to me who gave this interpretation. And when the messenger came, Yusuf ﷺ says, go back to your master and ask him about the case of the women who cut their hands. So the situation that led to his imprisonment. Surely my Lord has full knowledge of their cutting. And what I want to point out from this is he was sitting in prison for years, and an opportunity for him to leave prison comes to him. And instead of just, instead of saying, yes, finally I'm out, instead he says, I'm an innocent man. And when I come out, I want to have my innocence recognized and intact. And look at how he was so confident. Look at that confidence that his spirit wasn't crushed. He held on to the person that he knew he was. And so he has this confidence in advocating for himself. Again, another situation where he advocates for himself. And so a lot of times when something difficult happens in our lives, we experience self-doubt. We start to question ourselves. We start to question our skills. Something happens at work. You have a bad, a bad situation at work, and you suddenly start to question your skills in your job. You have a difficult situation with your child, and you start to question your ability as a parent, right? We start to question these things, and we start to experience self-doubt. But the Prophet Yusuf ﷺ, he shows us that his circumstance didn't dictate his perception of himself. That he knew who he was. He knew he was honorable in the sight of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And that's something important for us to realize too, that sometimes our circumstances are not going to accurately reflect who we are. And to realize that oftentimes the opinion of other people does not align with the opinion of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Sometimes the most beloved people to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala are the ones who are invisible to us. And the most hated people are the ones who are admired by so many, right? So not to confuse the opinion of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala with the opinion of people. Now, in the story of Yusuf alayhi salam, the next part is that the truth comes to light. The women, including the wife of the Aziz, admit that they were in the wrong. And so he is declared innocent. And so we start to approach the end of his trial. And so once his name is cleared and it's made known that he was imprisoned unjustly, the king comes to him and he says, today you are highly esteemed and fully trusted by us. So imagine after everything that Yusuf alayhi salam has gone through, hearing these words told to him by the king. Imagine how that must have felt. Imagine how you would feel. Somebody you really respect, after you went through so much hardship, somebody you really respect tells you that you are fully trusted, you're admired by them, enumerates your good qualities. And then Yusuf alayhi salam what I love about what he does in this situation is it's really unexpected. Is instead of just saying thank you and just, going on his way, he says, you know what? I think you should put me in charge of all the storehouses, of all the food in this land, because I'm honest and I'm knowledgeable. And I love that he does that because he didn't doubt that he was capable. Even after being imprisoned all these years, he doesn't doubt that he's capable. He knows what his capabilities are and he never gives up. He knew that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was taking care of him this entire time. And then he took steps to create positive change in his life by advocating for himself again. There's so much in his story about advocacy. And so it's accepted. He becomes the minister of like the most important thing in the land, the most important area of the land in especially a time of famine. And so when we go through difficult experiences, sometimes it can shake the way we view ourselves and have that self-doubt. But instead, just like the Prophet Yusuf alayhi salam, consider the strengths and qualities that this trial might be allowing to come from you. Prophet Yusuf alayhi salam, in this time in jail, what stood out is that he was knowledgeable and that he was honest, that he was trustworthy. Everything he shared was based in truth, and everything he shared was based in a knowledgeable skill he had, right? And so sometimes considering the strengths that we have, the qualities that we needed in order to survive a trial, that can make a huge difference in the way that we persevere after that trial. And so here, that's where we see so much of this post-traumatic growth with the Prophet Yusuf alayhi salam. And so in the toward the end of the story of Prophet Yusuf alayhi salam, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions this is how we established Yusuf in the land to settle wherever he pleased. And this part of this verse, it tells us that how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala opens doors for all of us. This verse is not just about Yusuf alayhi salam and the doors that Allah opened for him, but it's the doors that are possible for all of us through the hardship that we go through as well. And then Allah says, we shower our mercy on whoever we will, and we never waste the reward of the good doers. So sometimes Allah plans, we plan, but Allah plans, and His plan is the best of plans. And our job is the effort. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, we never waste the reward of the good doers. Even if we plant the seed, we never see it come to fruition, we try and we try and we try and we don't see it to come to fruition, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is promising us that our reward will never be lost. And that an opportunity to do good is an opportunity of good in and of itself. And then Allah says, but the reward of the hereafter is far better for those who believe and are mindful of Allah. And so post-traumatic growth is about understanding that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sees every bit of good and every bit of hardship, and that our stories are going to culminate in the best of ways, inshallah, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the one that's taking care of us as well. And so when you're feeling alone, when you're feeling hopeless, remembering that the reward of the hereafter is far better, and not to give up as well. And so the story ends finally with Yusuf alayhi salam being reunited with his brothers. But what happens when Yusuf alayhi salam sees his brothers? He's in a position of power now. But what does he do? Does he take revenge on his brothers? He doesn't. And imagine, after so many years of hardship that he wouldn't have gone through if his brothers hadn't done what they did, right? All those years of hardship, and finally the perpetrators are right in front of him, and he chooses not to take revenge. Could any of us do that? I don't know. I think that that's a very, very hard choice to make. And so he's in power. He's in a position of power over them after they were in a position of power over him. And they misuse that power, but he chooses not to. And so when they realize that he's Yusuf alayhi salam, Yusuf alayhi salam says, Allah has truly been gracious to us, and surely whoever is mindful of Allah and patient, then certainly Allah never discounts the reward of the good doers. And he starts this in this verse, he says, I am Yusuf. I am Yusuf. And I think that that's such a powerful moment when you think about it, of having been a nameless slave for a big part of his life, and now reclaiming his name in front of the people who hurt him so deeply. it's a powerful reminder. And then in the rest of the verse, he's reclaiming his identity too as a worshiper of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that he never lost to begin with. And so asking ourselves, who are we at our core, and how do we show up in times of difficulty, and how do we show up when that difficulty is gone? Because a lot of times, like, this whole talk is about how do we get through struggles in a way that brings us closer to Allah. But what do we do after the struggle is gone? Yusuf alayhi salam used that opportunity to continue to step toward Allah rather than to step toward his ego and get that revenge. And so it's a very powerful reminder for us as well. And then he responds even more powerfully, there's no blame on you today, to his brothers. May Allah forgive you. And when we talk about the antidote to feelings of jealousy, feelings of intense pain and hurt against others, one of the antidotes to that is making dua for that person. But if I ask you to think about the person who's hurt you the most and ask you to make dua for them, that is hard. It's very hard to do. But Yusuf alayhi salam, in that moment of facing them when he didn't expect to face them, forgives them, attributes what they did to shaitan, takes away their blame, and then asks Allah to forgive them. And so one of the most profound manifestations of our faith is how we deal with others, especially the people in our lives that are hard to deal with. And so the Prophet Yusuf alayhi salam understood that his brothers were being tested, but that he was being tested too. And so in not choosing revenge, he chooses to channel his energy in a direction to be reunited with his family and to get closer to Allah. And that's something important for us to realize. When we allow so much space for negativity in our minds and in our hearts toward people in our lives, we are depleting our reserves. We each have a limited amount of energy available to us, mental, emotional, spiritual. And when we use that energy to gear it toward revenge, toward hatred, we're using that energy. And so think, is that person worth it? Is that person worth the energy that you are giving them? We say that the mind is prime real estate space. It should cost a lot for somebody to live up here. And it should cost even more for somebody to live in your heart. And so that person is not worth it. So channel that energy, as the Prophet Yusuf alayhi salam did, in a direction that's meaningful. And then finally, the story ends where the Prophet Yusuf alayhi salam is reunited with his parents, and he says, so he hugs them and he welcomes them in, and he says, enter Egypt, Allah willing, safe and secure. And then he says, my Lord was certainly good to me when he took me out of prison and brought you here after shaitan had induced the estrangement between me and my brothers. Indeed, my Lord is subtle in what he wills. He is al-Latif, the subtle and the gracious, and indeed it is he who is knowing and the wise. And so again, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala never attributes wrong. The Prophet Yusuf alayhi salam never attributes wrong to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and he is at peace with everything that he's gone through. He says that Allah was good to me when he took me out of prison. He's not mentioning all of the other hardships of, but I had to go through this and I had to go through all of this. And so he understood that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was challenging him to become the person that he was meant to be. And this is one of my favorite names of Allah that he mentions here, Al-Latif, the subtly kind. This guiding hand of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that we can see in our own lives, where Allah takes us where we need to go and gently moves us with kindness to where we need to go, even if what we're going through doesn't feel kind. And that's a part of trusting in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and his wisdom. And so looking at our struggles as an opportunity rather than just something to endure. Looking at yourself and what you're gaining, what skills, what qualities, what relationships you're gaining through those struggles as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala opens the doors for you, and then asking, yourself, who is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala positioning me to become through this struggle, is something that is incredibly transformative and something that the Prophet Yusuf alayhi salam really illustrates to us through his post-traumatic growth throughout his journey. Jazakumullah khair. And inshallah, if you have any questions, I was told we could use a few minutes for those. Go ahead.
I don't really have a question. I'm more of like a statement, but I'm just like what you described really resonates with me because I feel like that's what a lot of reverts go through that leads them to like Islam, that trauma, because Islam is that comfort.
Jazakallah khair. What she mentioned, if you didn't hear her, was it really resonated with her because what she noticed is that that's what often leads people to Islam, is the trauma that they go through and having like a different understanding. And so Jazakallah khair for sharing that. All right. Go ahead.
Would you say there's another name that resonates with Prophet Yusuf other than the story of Prophet Yusuf? Other than the name Al-Latif?
So she asked, would you say that there's another name that really resonates with the story of the Prophet Yusuf other than Al-Latif? I would say, sorry, I lost one of my microphones. I would say that one of the ones that really stands out to me is Al-Hakim, that Allah is the most wise. And the reason for that is, I'll hold it. The reason for that is we see, one of the beautiful things about the story of the Prophet Yusuf alayhi salam is that we see the culmination of it. We see the happy ending. And so throughout the journey of the Prophet Yusuf alayhi salam, it feels like he's getting further and further and further away from the goal, right? Like, he goes from a well to slavery to imprisonment, right? And then the person forgets about him when he's in prison. And so it feels like he's getting further and further away from the goal. But in the culmination of the story, you see the wisdom of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, where if one of those steps had been missed, he wouldn't have been in that position. He wouldn't have been reunited with his brothers. He wouldn't have had that opportunity to have power over them in that moment and kind of end his story in a different way on his own terms. So that's the name that stands out to me. God.
No, it's just you.
Cosmic.
Because he can recap on the 5 post-traumatic.
Sure. So she's asking me to just recap on the post-traumatic growth qualities. Okay, so excellent question. So the first one is a greater appreciation of life. The second one is closer relationships. The third one, identification of new possibilities, being able to see new opportunities in your life. Fourth, increased personal strength. And fifth, greater spiritual development. You're welcome. All right. Jazakumullah khair, everybody, for listening.